Hello everybody, doing a laundry room wall. They had to open up this large wall area so they can reconfigure the plumbing and the electrical. So now they called the drywall repairman over to sheetrock this and get it all coated and textured. This is basically a job. It calls for about one sheet of drywall. So this is the same process on a job, one sheet of drywall. Laundry room wall, bedroom wall, whatever you have, it's the same process. Thing with this wall, it has a lot of detail cuts around all the receptacles and plumbing and stuff like that. Step one, I always want to check the wall. I want to mark all the studs. Then I want to get my measurements of the wall. Get my measurements, and then I'm going to start with the biggest piece of sheetrock. So I'm going to get my big piece of sheetrock. Use a T-square, razor blade, cut it. I like to bring my sheetrock in the room so I can measure my boxes. There's a lot of boxes here, so you want to get as close as possible. I just basically take the measurements of one side of the box and the other side of the box. This is the technique you do when you do keyhole hand saw outs. You can also use a router, but in a router in a homeowner's house kicks up a lot of dust. A router sometimes makes the best perfect cuts, but in this situation with pipes in the wall, electrical, homeowner's kitchen next to it, I'm just going to cut it out. It takes a little more work. Sometimes your cuts are off a little bit, no worries, but we're just going to get all these areas marked off. I'm just using a pencil, a level, and a T-square to just basically pencil off all the areas. And just basic technique like this works pretty good. There's other techniques, but this is the technique I use. It works for me. You just gotta do what's easiest for you so you can get the project finished. That's the goal here, is to get the job done quickly and efficiently. But this T-square works good. You can see I can mark all my areas nice and straight. There's a lot of boxes here. Usually a wall isn't this busy. So we're just trying to mark all the areas. I'm going to cut out the areas. Like I said, you're not always going to be right on the money. If you're right on the money, then hey, congratulations, you did a good cutout. But if you're off 1/8, 2/8 of an inch, even a ½ inch, no worries. You can always put in a little piece of sheetrock in that mistake, or pre-fill it with mud and tape over it. Once I got all my areas penciled off, I'm just using a keyhole saw. This is a cheap little keyhole saw. It's less than $10, and this thing works like magic. This is perfect for detail cuts like this. Boxes, little areas like this. You can just use this keyhole saw and cut everything out by hand. And if you need to clean it up the edges, you can use a razor blade to clean up the edges of your boxes. Measure everything. I like to go off the angle of the drywall so I get a more precise off with the razor blades so they fit in place. If you have gaps next to your cutouts, don't worry. Even the best drywallers are never on the money. Go ahead and just, you're going to tape and fill in these gaps anyways with tape. So don't worry. Don't beat yourself up that you made a mistake. Like I said, even the best sheetrockers make mistakes, especially when you're doing hand cutouts like this. If you want perfect cuts, you got to use a router, but routers make a lot of dust, and you got to know what you're doing when you're using a router. Add screws. I can never emphasize this enough. Screws. You need screws every 3, 4, or 6 inches. You got to add plenty of screws. This to tighten up the area. Add screws in your baseboard wherever you can. Plenty of screws. You can put too many screws, so a rule of thumb, just keep it symmetrical. Do, I would say every 3 or 4 inches add a screw, and then nice symmetrical screw layout. Make sure all the screws are recessed in the sheetrock. You don't want no screw heads sticking out, because when you go to mud, that'll cause a lot of problems. Always add screws to the outside existing sheetrock. This is to tighten up the old sheetrock. You don't want a loose sheetrock there, so when you go to tape mud, if the original sheetrock's loose, then you might get a crack. So always add screws on your outside edges of your original sheetrock. Get all your detail cuts, all your small pieces of sheetrock, get everything cut, installed. These smaller pieces, I like to use a rasp on them. A rasp cleans up the edges. Get all your measurements, all your cutouts, get all your screws installed. Once all the screws are set, everything's good to go. Now you're ready to mask off the area. With this, it's a spray texture, so I gotta mask off all the receptacles, mask off the floor, basically to contain the area from dropping any mud. You could also do this before the sheetrock process, but I've always had problems with the sheetrock tearing the plastic, so I always do this after. Of course, if you're on carpet or something, you're going to have to prep the floors before. Since this is tile, it's easy to sweep it up. Get everything masked off, baseboards, receptacles, the flooring, get everything ready. I like to use this 1.5 or 2-inch tape, works best for this. 1-inch tape, you're fighting with the tape too much, so it's better to use bigger, wider tape for masking. Once you get the area all prepped up, masked up, now you're ready to start the fiberglass taping technique. I always use fiberglass mesh tape on all my repairs. I know a lot of videos out there, guys use paper tape or whatever. The only time you'd use paper tape if you're doing like a fire taping technique or you're doing angles. People like to use paper tape in angles. The only time you use it in drywall projects, if you're taping large areas, and then we use a tool called the bazooka or a banjo that puts on the paper tape. With the paper tape, you have to make sure you have enough mud in there. The mud has to be just right, and you can get blisters and a lot of mistakes. So your go-to item for fiberglass taping, always use fiberglass taping. You can also use it in the angle if you do it at 90 degrees. Do it around all your boxes, all your detail areas, all your joints, any gaps. Get everything fiberglassed. Once you get the areas all fiberglassed, then you're ready to go. I like to follow through with my 6-inch knife and press down on the tape. I don't want the bulges in the tape, so I want the tape pressed down nicely on the sheetrock. Once you get it all fiberglassed, then you can turn around and do a first coat. With this first coat, I'm using a quick set mud. This is a 5-minute mud. I have to use quick set muds on my jobs because I have to finish these jobs in one trip. I can't do them in 2 or 3 trips because I couldn't make a living if I had to keep driving to these jobs across town 3 or 4 times just to do a small job like this. Quick set muds you have to mix by hand. I like to mix a pan at a time. Some guys like to mix big old buckets, but it's just one guy here, so it's easier just to do a pan at a time. I love 5-minute. I can't emphasize it enough. I like to use it, but you have to work fast with it. If you don't work with muds, always use a joint compound. Always, always, always use a joint compound. With joint compounds, you have plenty of work time. If you make mistakes, you can sand away your mistakes. With these quick set muds, once they set up like a cement. It's strong. You can sand it away, but it's really tough. It's like trying to sand cement off the wall. So if you're not comfortable with mudding, and you have to question yourself, then just use a joint compound. With joint compounds, they have to dry overnight, of course, before you can do the second or third coat. Get everything coated nicely, angles, all your rows of nails, around your boxes, your joints, everything needs a first coat on. First coat I'm not putting on super heavy, I'm just doing like a skim coat. We don't want to put big old humps in the wall. If you put a big old hump on the wall of mud, then you're just going to have a big hump on the wall. So sometimes with these muds, you don't want to put it on too heavy. If it's still thin the next go around, then add a second coat. If it's still too thin, then do a third coat. It's easier to add a coat than it is to have a big hump on your wall. And once your mud's set up, with these quick set muds, you have to slick it out with a 6-inch knife and a sponge. You're basically taking off the extra materials. It's cleaning it up. It's kind of like a wet sanding technique, but instead of sandpaper, you're using a wet sponge and a 6-inch knife. If you use joint compounds, you're going to have to let them dry overnight and then turn around and sand it with either 80 to 150 grit sandpaper. Once everything's all slicked out or sanded out, now you're ready for a second coat. The second coat process is the same as the first coat, but the mud's just a tad bit thinner. You want to thin down the mud, and you're just doing a tight second coat. You're not putting the mud on super heavy. The original first coat was the fill-in. The second coat is meant to just make a nice, perfect, clean coat over the original coat. If your second coat's not perfect, then you can always do a third coat. Most of my jobs are only done in 2 coats because I work with muds a lot, so I can get away with doing 2 coats. But if you don't do much mud work, you might have to do a tight third skim coat, which is okay. And I always like to do third coats with a joint compound. It makes it perfect. But with this is a spray texture, so the texture is going to cover a lot. So I'm just doing a 2-coat process with hot muds on this, getting it all coated out. Then I'm going to follow through with the sponge and 6-inch knife as the second coat sets up. Once the area is already second coated or third coated, you're ready for texture. With this, it's a spray knockdown, so I got to use a spray technique, spray prep. I need air compressor hopper. I use joint compounds. With these joint compounds, you have to mix them up real creamy. It has to be mixed up creamy, creamy, creamy. You don't want no clumps and goobers in your mud, because those will spray through the hopper onto your wall and make mistakes. The mud consistency of most textures is like a heavy pancake batter. It's kind of like a Goldilocks zone. It has to be just right. So just a thick, creamy, heavy pancake batter is the usual consistency of most, if not all, textures. Basically, with the spray textures, splatters, orange peels, knockdowns, you want to spray the area in a nice, consistent, symmetrical pattern. Nice, even, same strokes, so you have the same spray consistency throughout the whole project. I pay a little more extra detail around detailed box areas, angles, baseboard areas, stuff like that. And basically just spray, spray, spray in one direction. You can either go up and down, side to side, it doesn't make a difference. Just nice, even sprays. And if you want up and down, then you want to cross it off by side to side. So always cross off your spray texture. You could even do a couple cross offs diagonally. That's just to fill in so there's a nice consistent pattern there. Sometimes with the air compressor, you're using pressure, so the pressure changes a little bit. So that's why we like to cross off our textures so we know it's nice consistent pattern on the spray area. Spray nice and slow. You just want to spray the area. I always go a foot or so past the mud work so it blends into the existing areas. This is a spray knockdown. Spray knockdowns are sprayed like a splatter texture. You would spray a splatter on it and then knock it down. There's a lot of knockdown tools. I've seen rubber tools. You name it, there's knockdown tools out there. They're gimmicky. Maybe if you're spraying a whole 100-foot ceiling or something, you want these fancy knockdown tools. But I just use a regular 6-inch knife. The 6-inch knife doesn't cover a lot of ground, you know, compared to a 12-inch knife. But the bigger the knife, the more bowed the knife might be. There's not a such thing as a perfectly straight knife. But with your 6-inch knife, you have more straightness out of all the knives, if that makes sense. So that's why I like to use my 6-inch knife. It's easier to control. You don't get no flat spots on your spray knockdown. So just use your 6-inch knife. It has to be clean. Use a straight part of your knife. I always like to carry a wet sponge with me so I can keep the 6-inch knife damp and clean. So I just basically knock off. I start from the angles and just knock each way and just slightly knocking down. I'm not pushing down on the knife. I'm not putting any pressure. The knife is basically gliding over the mud and knocking down the pattern. That's all you're doing here. You could also just leave this texture with a splatter and then turn around the next day and sand it to give you a knockdown finish. That would give you more of a lighter knockdown look. And sometimes that's the pattern that the walls call for. But with this, it's a medium-sized knockdown, so I'm just going to knock it down. Easy, easy, easy. I'm just taking my time. This is where you can make mistakes. If you have any boogers or goobers in your mud, you want to pick those out before you knock it down. Because if you get a goober in your mud and you hit it while you're knocking down, it's going to pull scratches in your wall. So sometimes if the mud isn't perfectly mixed, you're going to get goobers. Sometimes you need to strain the mud with like a spaghetti strainer or something like that, or pump it through. If you get a lot of goobers on the wall, you might have to just wipe down the wall and start over, because too many goobers are a bad thing on the spray knockdowns. 1 or 2 is normal. You just pick them out with your fingertip, no big deal, before you knock it down. Keep your 6-inch knife nice and clean and just knock down slowly. Nice consistent patterns. If you go one direction, follow through the same direction. Then you can come back and double check all the areas at a different angle with different lighting to make sure you got everything knocked down. If you miss some knockdown spots, no worries, because before you paint, you're going to have to lightly sand this area with like 150 to 220 grit sandpaper, and then primer and paint. So it's basically, this is a video on doing a one sheet repair job. This is a laundry room. Your project might not be in the laundry room, but you might have a one sheet project, and it's pretty much the same step process. So you just get the sheetrock installed, turn around fiberglass tape, first coat, second coat, third coat if need be, and then follow through with your texture. And depending on your region, you have different type of textures. There's smooth, sprays, skip trails. There's so many different textures. So you just want to get the area at least ready for texture if you're not comfortable doing the textures. Once you get the area all textured up, go ahead and pull all your masking. Don't let your masking sit overnight. You want to pull all your masking, clean up the area, clean up all your tools, clean up your washout area, clean up everything. You're done with this project. You're going to have to let it dry for 24 hours. Then you can turn around, sand it with 150 grit to 220 grit. Primer is a must. You must always primer drywall, then paint. Hope this video was helpful. Please go ahead and like and subscribe. Thank you for watching.